Hey guys, this is for APUS. This is your asynchronous lesson for Tuesday. I'll be posting another one tomorrow. These are going to be a little bit briefer than they will typically be, just because we're going to talk about the Spanish-American War in these videos, and I want to be able to divide it up between the two videos. So today we're going to talk about but the videos will typically be longer, so just brace yourself. And also remember to always watch these videos. I'm relying on you watching all these videos during your asynchronous days to kind of understand what we're talking about on our live days. So please make sure you're watching these consistently on your asynchronous days, and I promise I'll be good in terms of posting them, for you to be able to watch during the synchronous time. So please make sure you've been watching these videos. All right. So today, now we're going to talk about how the United States wound up getting into war with Spain in 1898. We were talking today about how the United States began embracing a more imperialist policy in the 1890s. 1880s and 1890s, we discussed the reasons for that. And as America began thinking about, was beginning having these imperial dreams, there was, along with that, a corresponding hawkishness, right, and aggressiveness. There were a lot of people who believed that the United States should be a lot more assertive overseas, more militaristic, more nationalistic, right? Because often that goes together, right? If you want to become expansionist, then you also have to be militaristic, because people tend not to just allow you to conquer them, right? So it generally means that if you're going to be imperialist, that you're also going to be a lot more militarist. Now, U.S. Imperial Dreams began focusing in the 1890s again on Cuba. Now, remember, Cuba and the United States has a long history together. Cuba is only 90 miles from the United States. It's long been the subject of fascination and interest from a lot of Americans, dating back to the 1840s and 1850s. Remember, if you remember from last year, a lot of Southerners had actually wanted the United States to conquer Cuba. Cuba had slavery. It was perfectly legal in Cuba. And a lot of Southerners believed that conquering Cuba would allow them to expand slavery, or at least perpetuate slavery. And it culminated infamously in 1854 with the Ostend Manifesto, which was signed by the U.S. ambassador to Britain, the U.S. ambassador to France, and the U.S. ambassador to Spain, where they said that the United States would offer $100 million to Spain to sell Cuba, and if they wouldn't sell it, we would take it by force. $120 million. When the Ostend Manifesto was leaked, Northerners were enraged because they, quite rightly saw this as yet another Southern plot to actually expand slavery. So the United States, really, from this point on, we were just tracking about our own things, right? We had the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age, and industrialization from the United States. But attention began focusing again on Cuba in the 1890s. Now, Cuba was still owned by Spain in the 1890s and was the scene of a bloody insurrection against the Spanish. The Cuban people had been rebelling against the Spanish on and off for decades, but there was a pretty brutal insurrection taking place in the 1890s against Spain. Now, in 1895, another Cuban revolt, led by Jose Marti, and exiles who were living in the United States. Now, Jose Marti is one of the greatest national heroes, I think the greatest national hero of Cuba. He was a writer who wrote stories about about the desire of the Cuban people to be free. He's a hero to pro-Castro and anti-Castro forces alike in Cuba today. He's beloved. Now, the cause of the Cuban people began receiving a lot greater support, particularly in the United States, because of the tactics of the Spanish general who was put in charge of Cuba, a man named General Weyler. Now, General Weyler had the idea that, he was angry that the Cuban rebels fighting the Spanish were getting a lot of help from the people in the countryside. So his idea was basically to relocate all the people who lived in the countryside into basically concentration camps. Not death camps in the Nazi sense, but they often turn into death camps because when hundreds of thousands of people were actually moved into these camps to keep them away from the rebels, they weren't given enough food. Disease began spreading. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans died in these reconcentration camps that were actually that were put in place by the Spanish government. 200,000 is the generally accepted number dying of either disease or malnutrition in these camps. So when word got out about this horrible Spanish treatment of the Cuban people, when word got out to the United States, a lot of Americans became very sympathetic to the cause of the Cuban rebels. Now, fueling this anger, the anger of the public, were yellow journalists in the United States. Now, when we talk, the origin of that term, yellow journalists, is because newspapers used to have yellow comic strips. So journalists who wrote in newspapers with yellow comic strips were called yellow journalists. When you say yellow journalists, usually has a very negative connotation. You're implying, shady, sensationalist reporters who just basically exaggerate things just in order to sell newspapers. So it usually has a negative connotation when you say yellow journalist. Now, the most prominent yellow journalists in the United States at this time were a man named William Randolph Hearst, who published the New York Journal. If anybody's ever seen Citizen Kane, which is usually considered the greatest movie of all time, even though I saw it again this summer and wasn't really thrilled about it, to be honest. But Citizen Kane is actually based on the life of William Randolph Hearst, probably the most famous yellow journalist at the time. Also a man named Joseph Pulitzer, who published a newspaper called the New York World. All these newspapers began wanting to outdo themselves by actually publishing the most sensational stories they possibly could about what Spain is doing to the Cuban people. William Randolph Hearst actually sent a photographer down at Cuba, and he said to the photographer, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." So a lot of these yellow journalists certainly had an agenda. It was to sell newspapers, of course, but it was also political. A lot of them were, sympathetic to the whole imperialist mission, and they wanted to sell, they want to sell the American public on the idea that we have to stop these Spanish atrocities toward the Cubans, that we have a moral obligation to do so. Now, a more liberal Spanish government took charge in 1897 and was at least considering more autonomy for the people in Cuba. But the yellow journalism continued, and they they continued selling these newspapers, exaggerating a lot of the Spanish atrocities in Cuba. But a lot of it, to be honest, weren't exaggerated. The Spanish were absolutely brutal to the Cubans. One of their most infamous tactics was to execute those who were fighting the Spanish regime and then hanging their bodies on lampposts throughout Havana. And the thing is, that was, as you can imagine, to scare the Cuban people out of any thoughts they might have of rebelling against the Spanish. Batista, who was the Cuban dictator in the 1940s and 1950s, began replicating those tactics at that time, and was one of the reasons why Castro ultimately took over in the 50s, because the brutality of Batista. Now, there were a bunch of incidents that happened in the road to war with Spain. We had the Spanish atrocities in Cuba. We had yellow journalists who are telling the American public just about how bad the Cuban people are being treated by the Spanish. In February 1898, a letter was leaked, a letter written by the Spanish foreign minister, a man named Delon. And the letter was a pretty harsh critique of the president of the United States at the time, William McKinley. And basically, it said that McKinley was a weak politician. All he cares about is applause from the crowd. He has no principles. And when the letter was leaked, a lot of Americans got very angry. Even if they weren't necessarily big McKinley supporters, the idea that, this foreign diplomat is actually insulting the president of the United States was just struck a lot of Americans as very, very wrong. And it really angered a lot of them. But the biggest incident, of course, that led us to war with Spain was the explosion of the USS Maine off the coast of Havana in February 1898. Now, the USS Maine was a battleship that was actually sent to patrol the coast of Havana. Just because all the craziness that's going on in Cuba, so the United States is just kind of keeping tabs on what's going on there. And on February 15th, 1898, the USS Maine exploded mysteriously, killing 266 Americans on board. Now, the natural conclusion that a lot of people had was that, well, of course, the Spanish did this. The Spanish were the ones who blew up the Maine, even though it's been pretty much accepted now that it was actually a mechanical failure that actually caused the Maine to explode. But if this ship that's off the coast of Cuba, just to keep an eye on the Spanish, just mysteriously explodes, of course, most people are going to think it's the Spanish who did it. So there became a refrain throughout the United States: remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And, kind of like replicating the old remember the Alamo, that was trying to stir a lot of the American people up into the idea of a righteous fight against an aggressor. So again, even though it was caused by a mechanical failure, it was thought at the time that Spain had actually been the one that blew up the USS Maine. Now, President McKinley was sympathetic to the whole imperialist cause, but he was not very eager to get the United States involved in a war. He had fought in the Civil War when he was a young man. He had some really bad memories of that experience, and he did not want the United States to actually be involved in a war. But ultimately, he gave in to the whole war fever. Sometimes it becomes, I know this sounds strange, but it becomes almost unstoppable, this rush to war. And it did in this case, even though this more liberal Spanish government had promised to give the Cubans self-rule by this time. But the pressure to actually get involved in the war became so strong, McKinley couldn't resist, and he went to Congress, and he asked Congress to declare war on Spain, and ultimately they did declare war on Spain on April 11th, 1898. Now, interestingly, along with the declaration of war against Spain, the United States Congress passed the Teller Amendment. Now, the Teller Amendment promised that the United States would never take over Cuba, even if Cuba won its independence at the end of this war with Spain. So I always think this is just a characteristically American thing, that, we're going to go in to Cuba, fight the Spanish. But the thing is that we still want to show that we're not doing it for selfish gain. So we said, even if Cuba gets its independence at the end of the war, the United States will not take over over Cuba. So I don't know. I just always think that's characteristically American. Now, the war lasted 4 months. John Hay, who was the Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, as a young man, I'm sorry, that's rocking a little bit. John Hay, as a young man, had actually been the private secretary to Abraham Lincoln, and now as an older man is serving as Secretary of State. And after the war was over, he called it a splendid little war. The war only lasted 4 months. 400 Americans were killed in the war, even though 5,000 in battle, but 5,000 American soldiers were actually died in the Spanish-American War. The vast majority of the casualties, the vast majority of the people who died in the Spanish-American War actually died of food poisoning from eating tainted canned meat that was actually fed to U.S. soldiers in Cuba. So very, very tragic. That's over 90% of all the casualties. Plus, in addition to food poisoning, a lot of American soldiers came down with yellow fever, which was spread by mosquitoes in Cuba, and then it wasn't eradicated until 1902 when American doctor Walter Reed actually went down to Cuba and helped eradicate yellow fever because they identified mosquitoes as being the cause. So most Americans actually who died in the Spanish-American War actually died of either disease or food poisoning, not in combat. Now, The war was a two-front war. It was a war in Cuba, obviously, was also a war in Asia. Now, I know that sounds totally random, like why Asia? Well, Spain had a huge colony in Asia, the Philippines. The Philippines, named after King Philip of Spain, had been owned by Spain since the 1500s. So the colony was hundreds and hundreds of years, the Philippines under the rule of the Spanish. There were many attempts in the Philippines to actually get their independence from Spain. Spain wasn't treating the Philippines very well, not much better than they were treating the Cubans. And there are a lot of people in the Philippines who welcomed American help in order to free themselves from the Spanish. But the question was, did the Americans and these Filipino rebels have the same goal, right? Did they both desire Filipino independence? We promised Cuba that they would have their independence at the end of the war, but we did not promise the Philippines that they would have their independence at the end of the war. So there we go. That's a potential quandary, and we found ourselves in that dilemma after the Spanish-American War was over. The Spanish military was so weak in the Philippines that we actually defeated the entire Spanish Navy. The American Navy actually defeated the entire Spanish Navy in an afternoon. They sunk all the ships, and they killed 380 Spanish soldiers. The Americans sailors. The American Navy actually suffered 0 casualties in that battle of Manila Bay. So the thing is that the Spanish were pretty quickly removed from the Philippines by the United States. And the Philippines are in this strategic location, which is very close to China. And this was at a time when all the different powers were actually scrambling to actually get access to the China market. So the Philippines were so close to China, we kicked the Spanish out, and now we were just there. So we actually have this question about what we're going to do. About that, about us being in the Philippines. That's what we're going to talk about in our next video. But the bulk of the fighting happened in Cuba, close to the United States. We were totally unprepared. We hadn't fought a war since the Civil War, and the military sent soldiers out to fight in Cuba with woolen uniforms. Now, this was like July, so just imagine going to Cuba in July with woolen uniforms. So we were totally ill-equipped. Plus, we're feeding them tainted meat in cans. So in many ways, we were totally unprepared for the fight. But ultimately, we emerged victorious, defeating the Spanish in Cuba within a matter of weeks. Probably the most famous regiment of the American regiment in the Spanish-American War was the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders was a unit organized by Theodore Roosevelt, who resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in order to fulfill his lifelong goal of actually being part of a war. So he actually raised this regiment of preppy rich kids from Harvard, ragtag groups of people from here and there, poor people, American Indians, cowboys from out west. It really was, and all these rich, snobby, elitist people from New England. So it was really this real motley crew of different kinds of people in his regiment, the Rough Riders. And it became the most famed regiment of the Spanish-American War, most climactic incident was Theodore Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill, which later turned out to be Kettle Hill, and then killing a Spaniard with his bare hands, apparently, and then raising the American flag on top of the hill. It became one of the most famous stories in American military folklore. It also made Theodore Roosevelt a national hero. So I don't know if Theodore Roosevelt ultimately would have taken the trajectory in his political career, which ultimately led to the presidency, that he took had it not been for leading the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. So we wound up, and again, there were so many problems in the early days of fighting. The man who was in charge was a man named General Shafter. He was morbidly obese, over 360 pounds, really in no position to be leading troops into battle. He had fought in the Civil War and just hang around, was still in the military 30 plus years later. So bad food rations, really rough conditions, woolen uniforms, but ultimately the United States wound up defeating the Spanish in Cuba. So now the question became, what is going, we just defeated the Spanish in this 4-month war. So the question became, what are we going to do with all the parts of the Spanish Empire that, now we had pretty much conquered? The U.S. military also went into Puerto Rico, which was a Spanish colony in the Caribbean, pretty much took over Puerto Rico without much of a fight at all. Also, we took over the island of Guam, which was a Spanish island in the Pacific Ocean. So all the Spanish Empire was basically, it was up to us to decide what to do with it. Are we going to make it part of the United States or not, or free them? It was really all up to us to kind of decide what we're going to do with all these parts of the Spanish Empire that, were now newly liberated now from the Spanish. But the thing is that the Spanish Empire was pretty decrepit by this time. Like, they really, as you could see by the fact they were defeated by us within 4 months, right? We didn't exactly have the strongest military in the world. So, but it was still an empire of sorts, right? So there was a lot of land, that they had, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba. So now the question became, what's going to happen to all this land? All right, guys, so that's what we're going to talk about in our next video. Again, this is shorter than videos will typically be. I deliberately wanted to split up this the Spanish-American War into 2 videos, but they'll typically be longer. Please remember to watch these from start to finish. And since you guys all have your textbook, I will start posting assignments. I know, right? I'm sure we're all thrilled about that. On Google Classroom. All right, so I'll see you tomorrow in the next video. Peace.